the idea of this presentation is is to try to understand that what we can take and what we can learn from the new clinical trial designs and what was the rationale behind the conduct of these new trial designs. But before we discuss so-called new clinical trial designs, I just wanted to debunk a myth. You will see everywhere that the gold standard in conducting clinical trials are comparative randomized clinical trials. But in fact, there is strong evidence that RCTs are not the norm. So I will just present you an outline of a personal analysis that I conducted in 2008 on the clinical trial on the clinicaltrials.gov database. Basically, I downloaded the entire database and I conducted an analysis, a thorough analysis of the clinical trials registered in this database. At the time, it contained approximately slightly less than 200,000 clinical trials, which were registered in clinicaltrials.gov. These trials included slightly less than 150,000 interventional clinical trials and slightly less than 100,000 studies were completed. And you can see on this graph that most of these studies were conducted with involved medicinal products, medicines. What about the randomization? If you analyze, in fact, the design of these trials, and the information is structured to perform this analysis in clinicaltrials.gov, you will soon realize that approximately between 20 and 25% of these studies are absolutely not randomized. There is no random allocation of the intervention in these studies, which is really odd. So you've got approximately 20-25% of the studies which start to deviate from the gold standard that we advocate. If you look at the comparison, it's even more astonishing to me because only 2/3 of these trials are actually comparative. 1/3 of these trials are not comparative, which is even more astonishing. You can see that you've got some odd studies which have a crossover design. So I don't know whether it was a true crossover or whether they allowed some patients to cross from one arm to the other. I suspect it's a true crossover, but it represents a small number of these studies. But the point is, 1/3 of these studies were not comparative. And you can see differences depending on the stage of the studies, but you can see that also there is an important proportion of phase 3 and phase 4 studies which are not comparative. And about the masking, it's even more shocking. The majority of these studies are not blinded. So again, this is a personal study, but clearly the strong message is that the gold standard that we advocate, that we see everywhere, is in fact in real life not the norm. So, as you can see, or as we can infer, the RCTs in general have some general issues which are associated with the conduct of these studies. They have a lack of flexibility. Generally, they contain one primary objective and they generally have a poor external validity. In rare instances, they have a good external validity, but the norm is they have a poor external validity. They can be unnecessarily long, and it's absolutely true. It is often difficult to obtain evidence of efficacy in subgroup of patients, and the subgroup analyses are often exploratory. Any inferential subgroup analysis must be predefined and specified, and they require large sample size in general. Classic RCTs are not always suited or designed to address more complex scientific questions. So the main shift, or the main issue which was linked to the change in paradigm of the design of the study, for me, comes with the advent of new molecular targets, what we call biomarkers traditionally. We've got different types of biomarkers, but for this presentation, for the sake of this presentation, I will differentiate, I will just discuss two types of biomarkers, the prognostic biomarkers and the predictive biomarkers. A prognostic biomarker, it's a prognosis of disease progression. So it's a biomarker which is used to identify the likelihood of a clinical event or disease recurrence or disease progression in patients who have a particular disease. Whereas a predictive biomarker is a biomarker which will predict a response to a treatment. And again, the patient who express this biomarker, the predictive biomarker, will have a response to a treatment which will be different from the patients who do not express, in fact, the biomarkers. And the therapies targeted biomarkers, and we've got a lot, we had a lot developed recently, but the main starting point were the tyrosine kinase inhibitors. So the therapies targeting biomarker can target biomarkers which can be expressed in different types of organs and which can have different levels of efficacy. And the clinical prognostic and predictive values of biomarkers are not always fully characterized. So, and basically, you can see that let's compare, in fact, the efficacy, hypothetical efficacy results of a prognostic and predictive biomarker. You can see that on the top left-hand side, that this would be typically the results that we'd observe in a clinical trial, which is aimed at assessing the prognostic value of a biomarker. So you can see that the response to the treatment remains identical, but the prognosis of the disease depends on the expression of the biomarker. You would, on the top right-hand side, you would see typically the clinical results of a clinical trial aimed at assessing the predictive value of a biomarker. So you can see that the response to a given treatment depends on the expression of this biomarker. Okay, and of course you can have biomarkers which can be both prognostic and predictive biomarkers, and this would be you would have the clinical results which are displayed at the bottom of this slide. So what are the two basic designs of clinical trials which are aimed at assessing the values of biomarkers? Basically, biomarkers imply some kind of subgroup stratified analysis. So the first one would be a stratified design, okay? So you would have a starting population, you would screen for the expression of the biomarker, you would separate the subgroup of patients depending on the expression of the biomarker, and then you would perform your random allocation of treatment separately in patients who express or do not express the biomarker, and you would end up with the four groups that I have displayed in my previous slide. This is the first possibility. The second possibility is slightly different, which is called the biomarker-enriched design. And you would screen the population the same for the expression of the biomarker, but you would perform and study your medicine only on the patients who express the biomarker, since because your product would be your biomarker, would be a predictive biomarker. And this is the second possibility for this kind of designs. But you can see that in that basic design, you can study one kind of population, what kind of biomarker, and one intervention. And it all relies on subgroup analysis. Okay. So people started to think that biomarkers probably need some slightly more complex designs. And this is where the idea of master protocol clinical trials came into play. So the simple approach are compounded by the fact that biomarkers can be expressed in different tumor types. So one histology type of cancer can express different biomarkers which can be actionable. And the expression of the biomarker does not always guarantee that the product targeting this biomarker will be effective in this design. And again, these new clinical trial designs, the master protocol trials, were mostly driven by the advent of new anti-cancer agents, and namely the tyrosine kinase inhibitors. So what what are the potential advantages of this complex innovative trial designs? Why were they developed? And they were mostly developed for reasons of efficiency. I compare them to trial factories. So they avoid running studies when unnecessary, but because the treatment is ineffective, or there is, on the contrary, early evidence of efficacy. These studies have the ability to modify the allocation ratio to enable patients to receive the most effective treatments, and it was done in some studies. You can add treatment arms as new interventional products become available without having to rerun a trial. And this is extremely efficient. You can likewise remove treatment arms for futility or for safety, which are the pick the winner, drop the loser designs. You can set the trials at an early stage for success or lack of efficacy, which have different implications. They are also very useful to perform dose selection in clinical efficacy studies. They use an optimum number of patients while achieving the same goal with the same operating characteristics. And this is a major efficiency gain of these complex innovative trial designs. And platform trials can accommodate evolution of the standard of care. And again, this is a major efficiency gain. In terms of logistics, they can avoid running separate studies when the therapies are developed in the same indication. And we shouldn't overlook this aspect, but this also involves administrative and regulatory procedures like ethics committees approvals or regulatory approvals. When I say regulatory approval, I'm talking about the regulatory approval of the clinical trial, not the product. This is also particularly important in orphan indications or in studies conducted in small populations. And in the context of public health emergencies, for example, during the pandemic, we could see the major public health value of some of these studies, like the platform studies, particularly with the conduct of the recovery trial. The recovery, personally, I think that the conduct of the recovery trial was probably the supreme example of the public health value of the strength of the platform studies. And again, sorry, I just repeat myself, but in terms of public health value, the complex innovative trial designs have shown their major value. I mentioned recovery, but I could have mentioned some other studies like REMAP-CAP. And some other examples include STAMPEDE or SPY2 and so on. And also they can allow some more transparent no-go decision processes between the phase 2 and 3 phases in the seamless designs. I made this point because the development of medicines is often interrupted between the phase 2 and phase 3 studies. And you can see on the top of my head, a lot of studies were conducted on this, in this area to study this, but a lot of stopping of clinical trials or clinical development are absolutely not documented. It's not for reason of efficacy, it's not for reason of safety, it's purely for probably commercial reasons, which are ill-documented by the companies. And these trials offer a much more transparent way of making this go-no-go decision. So what are the issues to consider when designing, analyzing, interpreting results of complex innovative trials? I think it's important to keep in mind the 3 points. The first one is make sure that the operating characteristics of the trial, and namely the type 1 and type 2 errors, are maintained to a pre-specified levels. And in particular, it's extremely important to make sure that you don't have any inflation of the type 1 error to increase the risk of erroneous decisions. Likewise, these trials, it is extremely important to make sure that the internal validity of these studies is maintained, the randomization, the blinding, and any introduction of biases. And likewise, it is extremely important to maintain the integrity of the study. So missing or erroneous studies differential dropouts, and particularly during the follow-up period of the patient. So these are the three key issues which are a potential threat to these when conducting these complex innovative trial designs. So what are the different types of designs? There is no, you can see in the literature that there is no accepted definition of complex innovative trial designs. You've got some guidance from the FDA, but basically you've got three types of I include three types of studies in complex innovative under the umbrella of complex innovative trial designs. The first one are master protocols. So the master protocol studies are designed to test multiple interventions, multiple products, or multiple subpopulations under a single protocol without a need to develop a new protocol for every study. Okay, and the term master protocol is often used to design studies like umbrella, basket, or platform studies. The second type of studies are the adaptive designs, which are defined as a design that allows for prospectively planned modifications to one aspect or several aspects of the studies. So the allocation ratio, for example, the sample size, or the timing of the analysis. And the third type of studies are studies which are using a Bayesian approach, either for the monitoring or for the analysis of the study. Okay. So I will pause for a second before entering in the specific design of the study. But you've got in a study, you've got basically three variables that you can use to design your study. Okay. So let's take a classical randomized clinical trial design. So you start with your population. So you define a population that you will enroll in your study. This is your first variable. Then when you randomize, you've got your intervention. So you allocate randomly your intervention to a part of this population and your comparator to the second part of this population. And then the third variable is your biomarker, which will define your subgroups. And these are the two designs that presented earlier on. So the sequence is population, intervention, biomarker. But the idea behind the master protocols is to use these three variables in different order. So you will start with your biomarker. Based on your biomarker, you can define several populations. You can choose the populations to be enrolled in the study. And in the third, as a third variable, you will allocate your intervention. And this is what happens with the master protocol. You can see that you've got here on this slide, a very heterogeneous population, your starting point for your population. You will screen this population for the expression of the biomarker, which is your first variable. Then, depending on the expression of the biomarker, your second variable will be the histology type, your type of disease, which will be of your patients. And as a third criteria to design your study, you will have the intervention. And in the basket studies, nothing impedes you for randomly allocating your intervention to each of these subgroup of patients. Okay, there is a general misconception that basket studies are basically a basket of single-arm studies, which is what most of the companies have done so far. But in theory, you can randomize even in a basket trial. But you can see that the use of the three variables was the three variables were used in a different order to design your basket study. If we are talking, the second type of master protocol studies are umbrella trials. Okay, in terms of umbrella trials, you are reversing, in fact, your histology and the biomarker. So you start with your general population. From your general population, you will select different types of histologies. Okay, so you will you will perform your diagnosis, and you will conduct your study depending on the type of cancer affecting the patients. Once you have identified your histology type, then you can screen your patients for the expression of the biomarkers. And then, which is your second variable. And the third variable, again, you can perform your random allocation to give the intervention to these different patients with this histology and expressing the biomarker. So these are the master protocols, and you can see that compared to the basket protocols, again, the variables were reordered to perform the design of your study. There has been a classification which has been proposed for complex innovative trial designs designed around biomarkers, and this was published by Blackburn et al. In a British Journal of Cancer at the beginning of last year. And you can see that depending on the type of the population and the different population and the different, in fact, interventions which were studied in this protocol, this table provided some classification of the studies which were conducted, of the different designs which were proposed for these complex innovative trial designs. So these were the master protocols. In terms of adaptive designs, you've got broadly, I would say, 3 or 4 types of adaptive designs. The first one is clearly, the interim analysis, the group sequential designs. So the group sequential designs are basically clinical studies which will schedule an interim analysis at a given point of the conduct of the study, depending on the enrollment of the patients and the number of events generally observed in the clinical study. And the interim analysis, again, controls, you've got different types of interim analysis, and they will control for any inflation of the type 1 error. But basically, you can have interim analysis conducted for futility. So the interim analysis will not allow you to reject the null hypothesis, but they will tell you that the product which is studied in the trial is very unlikely to prove effective at the end of the study. So you will stop your clinical study early because basically your product is very likely to be ineffective. And again, I personally believe that futility analyses are absolutely great tools to make the conduct of clinical trials extremely efficient because you don't waste any kind of enrollment. You can stop your trials early, and they're absolutely great. The only thing is you've got different types of futility analysis. They can be binding or they can be unbinding. If the futility analysis is binding, the company commits itself to stop the clinical study. Most of the futility analyses are unbinding, so the company is free to decide whether or not to continue the study. And again, you don't have this information in most of the studies, and the rationale and the decision underlying the conduct or not of the study to me is very unclear. So you still have some drawbacks associated with the conduct of futility analysis. On the contrary, you can have interim analysis which are primarily aimed at rejecting the null hypothesis early. And so basically, it will tell you during the conduct of the study whether your product is effective or not. Discussing, in fact, the different types of interim analysis. So the interim analysis for futility or early efficacy. And the problem with the group sequential designs, where you've got an interim analysis which is aimed at rejecting the null hypothesis, is in many instances, the company will stop the recruitment of the patients your study will be interrupted early, and then you will miss some important follow-up of the patients. So this is the group sequential designs are the first type of adaptive designs. The other type of adaptive designs are pre-specified sample size reassignment, where typically you don't have any precise idea. The main reason being that you don't know what will be the incidence of the events in your study. So midway, you will perform a blinded interim analysis, and you will reassess, in fact, your sample size. The third type of interim analysis is to perform an adaptive randomization. So based on the number of events observed right in the during the conduct of your study, you will change your allocation ratio to favor the treatment which is proven to be the most effective, to try to come up with to try to reject your null hypothesis using the lowest possible sample size. And you have also adaptive trials with some adaptive enrichment design, where during an interim analysis you will decide to enroll, preferentially enroll a given type of patients. The next slide, please, Lisa. And finally, the third type of adaptive designs are the seamless phase 2, phase 3 studies, during which we combine, in fact, those phase 2 dose-finding studies with your phase 3 confirmatory trial. So you will test different doses during your phase 2 study. You will perform an interim analysis. You will drop the arms of your studies, phase 2 study, which are ineffective or less effective. So you will drop the doses which basically are ineffective, and you will only select the dose which is proven to be the most effective, and in a seamless way, you will perform your phase 3 confirmatory trial based on the phase 2 study. And these seamless phase 2, phase 3 studies are again extremely efficient because they allow you to do some dose-finding studies and some a confirmatory study within the same study. Next slide, please. So the next type of complex innovative trial designs are Bayesian studies. And so the Bayesian studies are based on the Bayes theorem that I have just reminded you on this slide. And the Bayes theorem is based on the choice of a prior probability, so likelihood, a probability which reflects, in fact, the distribution of the event that will be observed. The only thing is the Bayesian designs, in general terms, rely on the choice of this prior probability, and this prior probability can lead to a wrong rejection of the null hypothesis because it can be what we call informative. And if you look at the FDA guidance on Bayesian trials, it's a fairly tough guidance, and regulators are traditionally very reluctant to adopt Bayesian studies because of the danger that these studies carry to wrongly conclude that a product is effective if the product is in real terms is not. Next slide, please. So the Bayesian studies are not really picked up by regulators at the moment. And you can conduct Bayesian studies or Bayesian analysis of clinical trials for two different purposes. For monitoring and adaptation, so you can use the design to do some sample size readjustment, change your allocation ratio, conduct some interim analysis, or apply some stopping rules. But you can also use Bayesian analysis for the hypothesis testing, i.e. the acceptance or rejection of the null hypothesis. Next slide, please. So the issues with the clinical trials and Bayesian adaptations is they borrow information from previous experiences, and they can unfortunately use prior distributions which can be informative. But most of these studies, it's important to highlight that most of these studies use classical design, so randomized clinical studies, including a primary hypothesis on sample size, to be conducted. They should reflect the choice of this prior, as I have tried to explain, is extremely important when you are conducting this kind of studies. And you must have different types of priors when you run these studies. And they should reflect what we call positions of ignorance, skepticism, and enthusiasm. And they are not necessarily pre-specified, unique, known, or important, and there is no correct choice in terms of prior. The advantages, they allow clinical trials adaptation. So the clinical trials tend to be much more efficient. With reduced sample size, you can stop your clinical trials early, and they can allocate patients very efficiently. They can use predictive modeling for trial adaptations. They can be used also for sequential analysis, but this is a much more controversial issue because a lot of authors claim that there is no inflation of type 1 error, but this is extremely controversial. So next slide, please, Lisa. So it gives you an overview of the number of adaptive trials which were registered in clinicaltrials.gov between 2001 and 2013. And you can see that the use of adaptive trials has really skyrocketed over time. And the adaptive trials are probably the trials which are, in terms of complex innovative trial designs, which are the most popular by far at the moment in the field of clinical development of medicines. Next slide, please, Lisa. In clinicaltrials.gov, again, you can see the evolution of the adaptive designs over time and the purpose of these trials with an adaptive hypothesis, the seamless phase 2, adaptive randomization, and so on and so forth. But again, the bottom line is the use of these adaptive design has dramatically increased over the last 10 or 15 years. Next slide, please. So from a kind of reimbursement perspective, clinical complex innovative trial designs will raise different issues with respect to the estimate of the relative treatment effect. So for the trials which use a classic RCT architecture, but which will either use an unconventional statistical approach to monitor, then adapt the design, or to analyze the results of the clinical trials, you have the adaptive trials, the Bayesian monitoring analysis, and the master protocols. And you will have some trials which will, on the opposite, deviate from the classical RCT architecture. So the randomized controlled trial architecture, and there are the basket trials, which are often uncontrolled, which will require additional external comparison using generally observational methods. And you can see that whereas the first type of studies which use RCT architecture will often yield unbiased estimate and precise estimate of relative treatment effects, the conduct of basket studies is much more controversial. Next slide, please, Lisa. So it is important to try to mitigate the risk when you face these kind of studies. First of all, and the main risk is to control the risk of erroneous decision, particularly when you are conducting interim and Bayesian analysis. So you have to make sure that the operating characteristics of the trials, again, are maintained and controlled, particularly the type 1 error. You have to be careful about subgroup analysis, particularly in terms of power, and Bayesian analysis can, in a way, not artificially, but they can increase your power to detect differences, but again, this could be linked to the fact that your prior distribution can be informative. Can we introduce some biases in the treatment effect? Again, I discussed, in fact, the random eye bias, and it is at the moment, at least from a personal perspective, extremely unclear. And again, you've got this issue of non-binding futility rules, which to me are completely counterintuitive, but very popular with pharmaceutical industry. But again, you have this kind of lack of transparency on the decision which is made, the go-no-go decision which is made on the study. So next slide, please, Lisa. Again, it is important to maintain the internal validity and integrity of the study. The danger of interim analysis is they break the equipoise, and they can pose a risk to the internal validity and integrity. So, as soon as you conduct an interim analysis, if you publish the results of your interim analysis, of course, the investigators and patients will prefer to be enrolled in the arm of the intervention which is the most effective. So it will create a differential dropout. It will involve some early dropouts of the patients. So again, there are some dangers to conduct or issues attached to the conduct of interim analysis. And again, it is extremely important to have procedures in place for the dissemination of information and the conduct of these unblinded interim analysis, because there is a serious risk to the internal validity and integrity of the study. Next slide, please, Lisa. So it is extremely important to control the communication concerning interim analysis and communication between the sponsor, investigators, and patients. It is also important to maintain the follow-up to decrease the uncertainty on the efficacy due to the lack of follow-up. It is extremely important to make sure that you adhere to the study protocol to avoid any kind of deviations, and to maintain a controlled follow-up to obtain estimates of relative effectiveness on relevant endpoints, clinical endpoints, over a relevant period of time. And this is also, we tend to forget a little bit safety in these studies, but it is also important in terms of safety to make sure that you collect sufficient follow-up on your medicines. Next slide, please. When you are conducting Bayesian analysis, it is also important to perform sensitivity analysis. I have taken, in fact, the results of the core immuno trial, which assessed, in fact, the tocilizumab in the COVID, and you can see that they have presented sensitivity analysis depending on the different types of prior distribution that I mentioned earlier on, which represent positions of ignorance, uncertainty, or skepticism or optimism. And you can see that the influence of the choice of the prior distribution on the rejection of your null hypothesis, and on the probability that your null hypothesis is true or false. Next slide, please. So overall, the basket trials, in general, correspond to a very low level of evidence, because as I have discussed, they enroll different types of populations. They are conducted, it's basically a collection of single-arm studies which are not randomized. There is a quasi-impossibility to use historical controls because the biomarker status of the control is unlikely to be documented. And these studies, because they enroll different types of cancers, the only possible common endpoint is the overall response rate, with a tenuous relationship with the overall survival of the patients. Next slide, please. So in terms of pooling, again, in the basket studies, when you pool the effect, first of all, the clinical interpretation of this pooling is very uncertain. You carry the risk of having a false positive when the treatment effect is driven by the effect in one of these indications. When you have unequal sample size across the arms of the triangle. And likewise, you've got a risk of false negative. It is extremely important to explore any heterogeneity of effects. And in some instances, you have very small sample size in some arm of these studies. And again, you've got a risk of random high bias when you conduct this kind of studies. Again, keep in mind that for some products, the expression of the biomarker does not guarantee that a product will be effective. And it was the case for vemurafenib, for example, which is supposed to be effective in BRAF-mutated tumors and which proves ineffective in colorectal cancer. So again, you can see the potential limitations of these basket studies. Next slide, please. And they have just illustrated, in fact, this a simple graphic, in fact, the possible dangers associated with the pooling of the results of this kind of basket trials. Next slide, please, Lisa. So you've got some other issues which are associated with complex innovative trial designs. I just wanted to mention them because they are often overlooked, but they are important. In terms of planning and design, these studies are generally complex. They need to involve the statisticians. There is an issue with the funding because funding at the moment does not accommodate flexible designs. You've got some logistic issues. They often require important infrastructures and experienced teams. They are associated with analytical and monitoring complexity. They need to be reflected in the patient's informed consent. And again, it is not always easy to convey the complexity of these trials in informed consents. And there are some issues with the reporting of these studies. And there has been a specific consort statement, which was published in 2020, especially for these complex innovative trial designs. Next slide, please, Lisa. So in terms of conclusion, next slide, please, Lisa. So complex innovative trial designs, you've got some excellent, brilliant advantages of these trials. They provide a clear, an efficient way of developing new therapies. And again, I'm personally convinced that the public health value was demonstrated, particularly in the context of the COVID, with the recovery study. And the recovery demonstrated the massive value of the platform studies. The complex innovative trial designs, they involve different types of studies, adaptive designs and master protocols. Which is bad. Potentially, these studies have potential advantages and risk. The risk of erroneous decisions, a threat to the internal validity, and a potential threat to the trial integrity of these studies. But these risks, if the conduct of the study is very rigorous, these risks can be mitigated to a certain extent. The ugly, these trials are generally, some of these trials, and partially the basket studies are generally associated with increased uncertainty, and the basket studies, as I have tried to discuss, they are associated with a very low level of scientific evidence. And the good and bad trial designs are mostly driven by conditional early and, I would say, lenient regulatory approvals. So next slide, please. So I wanted to thank you before I finish my presentation. I have asked you to take your mobile. So can you take your mobile phone, and give me a shout when you have taken your mobile phone. When you have taken your mobile phone, can you switch on the camera of your mobile? Ouais, can you switch on the camera on your mobile? Mm-hmm. And can you scan the QR code, which is on this slide?
Okay.
Yes, can you scan the QR code which is on this slide? So you've got a message on the top of your screen. Can you click on this message and open Safari? Did you open Safari?
Yes. Of
So
course.
if you scroll down, you've got something which says save contact details. If you press on this button,
Okay. Ah, cool.
and you've got my contact details on your mobile.
How
Okay?
swish.
And you can save my contact details on my mobile. Right? So if you have any
That's very
questions,
cute. I like that.
thank you. So if you want to contact me, I cannot switch on my camera, Lisa. If you want to contact me, you've got my contact details. I wanted to thank you very much for your attention. Apologies for the disconnection, but I hope that you like the presentation.
Thank you so
And
much, Francois. Thank you.
I am happy to take any questions that you may have.
Yes, don't worry about the technical glitches. We'll edit everything so you'll be perfect on YouTube.
Can you allow me to switch on my camera, Lisa? I can see you all, but you cannot see me.
We can hear you perfectly. So I look forward to your questions. We're slightly running out of time, but those of you who can stay, please do stay. Please turn your cameras on, because I think this debate is quite interesting to keep it on record and to educate public further. So Rita, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I was writing in the chat because I have really to leave in 35 seconds. But I would like to thank Francois for this super interesting presentation. Very clear. It's difficult to explain such complex issues in a very clear and straightforward way. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Rita.
My comment, it's not a question, it's more a comment. I'm glad you mentioned the fact that availability of protocols and transparency and good reporting are even more important than usual when the complexity of the design is so much increased. So I think really we need to lobby for that. And the second point is to increase the training of people doing these trials. Because I think there is a really super team of trialists, mainly they are sit in UK and other countries, but I think the average of the training of the trialists in other countries, I'm from Italy and I can talk about Italy directly, is very poor. So I think training would be essential for those people doing these trials, but also for people that are using these trials to make decisions. And this is another big issues. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Rita. They are good points. I don't have any, I just agree with you. It's very good points.
Okay, thank you very much and goodbye to everyone. Have a good summer. Thank you, Lisa, for organizing this nice meeting. Bye-bye.
Thank you. David, you next.
Okay. I was quite surprised to hear you say that Bayesian methods are likely to give false positives, because if you use a skeptical prior, if you use a point null, the false positive risk is usually much greater than the p-value.
Yes, that's true. David. But because you can also use a very optimistic priors, you carry also the danger of making erroneous decisions, and this is why it is extremely important to have. Usually, when you conduct some trials with some Bayesian methods in them, it is extremely important to have a mixture of priors which reflect both skepticism, ignorant skepticism, and optimism. I didn't use the example. I didn't want to overload the slides, but I'm using a very silly example with a stupidly optimistic prior. And with the example that I was using, you can see that even if you accrue some patients, you still do not change the result of your analysis. So the choice of prior is extremely important. And David, if I can make this point, this is when I didn't put the statement from the FDA on the slides. But what the FDA says on the Bayesian studies is really harsh. They really say in their guidance that these trials had the possibility to lead to erroneous decisions. And for me, this explains the reluctance. And again, in a sense, I think it's a shame, the reluctance of regulators to adopt these trials in a more routine way.
Yes. Well, if they just mandated a simple comparison of a point null with versus the observed effect size, the effect would be the opposite, of course. If you give a prior of 50% for there being a real effect, of course, if you give it a prior of 90%, you can get anything you want, but that shouldn't be allowed.
I have a quick question for David and Francois. Based on your current thinking, are you more frequentist or Bayesian? Francois, you go first, and why?
I go first. I think for me the question is personally completely relevant because I was trained as a frequentist, but I love, you know, that I love Bayesian stats. I love them, just love them because they are just beautiful. But beyond the fact that they are beautiful, the Bayesian approach clinical trials has incredible advantages, which I still believe that it's a shame that we are not making more use of Bayesian approaches in real life. So I think we again, I don't like this kind of this kind of difference between or the kind of conflicts that you had or discussions, almost pointless discussions that you had between frequencies and Bayesian. I personally think that we've got different methods. We should use all these methods for our decision making. There is no reason to exclude one or method over the other for this kind of reasons. So I will, unfortunately, Lisa, you know me, I will tackle as usual. I will not answer your question. I will say that, and I genuinely believe that it's the case. Bayesian approaches should be more widely used, particularly in the regulatory field.
Thank you, Francois. David, if you have a quick comment, otherwise I'll go to question for Lydia.
Yes, well, I'm a sort of somewhat reluctant Bayesian because I've always thought that the prior problem was sort of insuperable. The trouble is, though, it is inevitably, indubitably the case that the p-value doesn't answer a relevant question. And the Bayesian method does. And the prior problem, I now think, can be resolved in a simple way by just comparing a point null hypothesis with the observed value as two different models. And if you do it that way, you can have calculate a likelihood ratio, and the likelihood ratio, according to Bayes' theorem, is what gives you the evidence from your experiment. That's surely what you're interested in. If you've observed p equals 0.05, it comes out to around 3 to 1 odds on there being a real effect, not 19 to 1, as you might quite mistakenly infer from the p-value. And that convinced me that there's a problem with the frequentist approach. In fact, I would really be quite happy if people just cited the likelihood ratio. It's slightly unfamiliar.
But David, you can see that, and I think you made the point, but the Bayes factor, despite all the drawbacks of the p-value, the Bayes factor did not enter in the kind of decision making process of the regulators and so on. And I think it's in a sense it's a shame.
Yes, well, the advantage of the likelihood ratio is that it is purely frequentist, and it shows very clearly the deficiency of p-values without having to resort to Bayes. I mean, you can calculate 1-on-1 plus the likelihood ratio and get a posterior probability of there being a real effect, but there's no necessity to do that. The Bayes factor or the likelihood ratio tells you what you need to know.
Thank you for your opinions. Lydie, you next, please.
Yeah, I have a more general question on the enthusiasm of the regulators like EMA and the Scientific Advice Working Party for this type of clinical trials. Of course, they're quite conservative in my gut feeling.
It's very different. For example, there has been an inflation of for example, group sequential designs. And I believe that the group sequential designs are the use of group sequential designs is mostly driven by the regulatory authorities for conditional early approvals and so on, because they allow submission of a marketing authorization application very early on the basis of and so on. And this is used and abused and so on. Again, the basket studies were accepted by regulators and they are associated with very low levels of evidence, but it comes from the regulatory field. So, so the regulators have been in a way favoring some of these studies for different reasons, and they are a little bit reluctant on some of the other studies for, again, other different reasons. It is probably very difficult for different pharmaceutical companies to conduct platform studies and so on. It happened in the past, but pharmaceutical companies are very reluctant to enter in the conduct of this kind of platform studies. They are mostly conducted by academia, which again is a shame. So the position of regulation, and if you look at some simple thing like guidance, there is some guidance from the FDA, but the EMA has been completely silent on any guidance on complex innovative trial designs, and we are still waiting for guidance from the EMA on this kind of study. So the regulatory authorities have been overall slightly ambivalent with these studies. They have advocated the advantages, and I think they were right, but it has deviated towards studies with low level of evidence, like some group sequential designs and basket studies. So
I have a follow-on question for this, Francois. We used to see the world where FDA mandated 2 identical trials to sort of have the confirmation and validation, and we've departed from this paradigm quite some time ago under the call for speeding up drugs to market and improving science faster. So we see more and more these innovative trial designs, and as you pointed out, some are bring lots of benefits and great solutions. But what is, from your point of view, whether it's connected to regulators or it's connected more to society, what can we do to validate? Because more and more trials come with very low level of evidence, and the idea is to get the minimum, absolute minimum number of patients, minimum requirements to get a tick box to get to the market. And we're struggling, obviously, with real-world pragmatic confirmations. Do you think regulators should play a role? Do you think we should develop some frameworks how basket umbrella trials should be validated, and should they be validated at all? Or we live in a world where who first gets the tick gets through, and that's it.
Replication still exists in some areas. So, and you are absolutely right, Lisa. Replication, from my personal point of view, is probably the strongest approach to have evidence that a product works or does not work. You still have some requirements, even astonishingly from the FDA, for replication, some studies in some areas. But you are right. Replication is not the norm anymore. because of the pressure to approve products as quickly as possible, as you have rightly illustrated. I think and I will probably shock everybody. I'm not against these early approvals. On the contrary, they've got some benefits, provided that you put in place approaches to make sure that you have a subsequent confirmation of the efficacy of your products. So, and it was, I think it was illustrated by a study, I can't remember, published in the BMJ. You know, the study on the infamous study which showed that only 1/3 of the anti-cancer agents had evidence on overall survival. They were registered on the basis of a conditional approval, and only 1/3 of the products were approved on the basis of evidence of gain in terms of overall survival. I think it's fine to have an initial authorization. What is absolutely shameful is you don't have the follow-up. You don't have the regulatory procedure to make sure that you obtain this evidence even after 2, 3, 4, 5 years after the initial approval. And this is where, yes, probably, Lydie, you might be right. It was published in the BMJ, but I can't remember what was the lead author. And this is where I think the system fails, where you don't have a trial is stopped early, you don't have any follow-up, you don't have any evidence on clinically relevant endpoints, and this is where the system is failing everybody. You don't have, for example, for all these anti-cancer products, a simple table saying, okay, this is the evidence that we had at the time of authorization. This is now what the product does on clinically relevant endpoint. So, and clearly the regulators are not doing their job. Personally, don't quote me on this one, but I genuinely believe that the regulators are failing the system in that respect. So the procedure, we should find to authorize these products early, but we should have evidence of long-term efficacy with these products. I know Lydie wanted to comment, but I know that from the patient perspective, I have discussed the issue of integrity of the studies. So as soon as you break the equipoise, it's very difficult to maintain the integrity of a study. And I perfectly appreciate that, but what I don't accept is that we do not try, at least. And when you break the equipoise on an interim endpoint, you should convey a message clearly that the equipoise is still valid because you don't have any evidence of, for example, overall survival. So I'm not taking this argument. I'm not convinced by the argument of the equipoise.
Thank you, Lydia. What's your comment?
Yeah. I just wanted to comment, indeed, in oncology, it's a difficult discussion between early access and then clinical benefit. But actually, in defense of the regulator, I think the regulator has to decide on benefit risk. And benefit risk is different, in my view, from really clinical benefit for the patient and added therapeutic value. And that's where the whole point of discussion is, I think. If you think of benefit risk versus for a patient who is end of treatment and has only 1 year to live, then yeah, you can give early access. But if in the end the clinical benefit, the overall survival quality of life is worth it, that's an HTA discussion, and that's where things are getting mixed up. And I hope now that we have European HTA approved, that will become more and more clear that they are looking at different things and they come from different angles, the regulator on the one hand and the HTA on the other hand.
But Lydie, I think this is something that I've tried to convey when I was at the EMA unsuccessfully for millions of years. When the EMA says we are assessing the benefit risk, no, it's not true. They are not assessing the benefit risk. They are assessing the efficacy risk. They are not assessing any benefit. They are not assessing any added value against the current standard of care. They are assessing the the efficacy risk ratio, which is completely different from the benefit risk ratio. But unfortunately, if you look everywhere in the legislation, in the Directive 2001/83 or in the Regulation 726, the terminology benefit risk is used everywhere.
Yeah.
And it carries a complete confusion and a complete wrong message, which is embedded, by the way, in the mind of the EMA. When you talk to the EMA everywhere, they will tell you, well, we do the benefit risk. No, you don't do the benefit risk. You are performing an efficacy risk, which is completely different. You are not assessing any kind of benefit. At best, you are assessing some kind of efficacy against the comparator of your trial. So there is a complete misconception of the regulatory work, which is mostly the confusion is maintained by the fact that they always tell you that they are assessing the benefit. No,
That's a claim.
no. And on the contrary, you've got a lot of studies which have shown that the added value of the products which are authorized at the moment, whereas they are authorized by the FDA or by VMA, the added value is very poor in most of the cases. So,
Absolutely.
but to make your point, Lydie, because I think your fundamental point was absolutely true, that the HTA bodies have now this responsibility to in a way select the products with their on the basis of benefit risk. But unfortunately, you can see that at the moment only a very small number of products, a very small proportion of products are not reimbursed. So I'm not sure that, and there is some pressure to relax a lot of pressure to relax, in fact, the standards also from the HTA authorities, both political pressure from the patient. So this safety net, my impression is this safety net will become more and more tenuous over time. We'll have more and more expensive products with more and more or with associated with less and less clear benefits in the future.
Thank you, Francois. Andrew, please go ahead with your question. You're muted if you couldn't mute.
You are muted, Andrew, which will facilitate my work to answer your question.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, thanks. No, very interesting talk. I'm interested in a particular area, that's these neurodegenerative diseases in children. And those diseases have a couple of properties.
Sorry, Andrew, I can't hear you. Your voice is very, very faint.
Okay.
Wait, it's better. It's better.
No, here we go. Okay, sorry. Equipment failures. Okay, is that better?
Right, perfect.
Okay, so I'm interested in neurodegenerative diseases in children, and those kinds of trials have some particular properties, and I'd be interested in if you have any reflections for those situations. One is that there's pretty high variance among individuals in the progression of the disease. And the other property, as you might imagine, is a very high perceived cost of being in the control group among the people that you're trying to recruit. And a couple of things that you've talked about, interim analyses or Bayesian priors, might be applied, but I'd be interested in your reflections on that for that kind of situation, if you have anything to.
Well, Andrew, this is why if you look at the slides, I mentioned at a certain point in time the usefulness of complex innovative trial designs in orphan disease, but also in small populations. And when I used the small population, I was not referring to the size of the patients, but I was referring particularly to the pediatric populations where you tend to have a very limited number of patients and in heterogeneous populations. And I particularly believe that these trial designs are of particular interest in these kind of small populations in pediatric trials, because you can maximize, for example, the sample size, and you can maximize the efficiency of your studies by stopping studies in which therapies are very unlikely to be efficient, for example. So they are particularly useful, not only, but in that part of in these situations.
Thank you. Any other questions from anyone?
Francois, very good talk. I'll just do a very quick question because I know we're near the end now. Do you think that there could be a bit more informed sort of educational remits around how some of these trials get published, with maybe a small paragraph at the beginning explaining why or what the rationale was for using a particular trial design, and that the same information on some of the registration sites for clinical trials may help? And then as a second question, can you give examples, maybe you can't off the top of your head, so I'm putting you on the spot, but whether of trials where an adaptive approach was taken and actually perhaps that was maybe a disadvantage, or examples outside of recovery and COVID where perhaps the opposite is true, and what were the learning points of that for taking forward when it is suitable and when it isn't suitable to use a particular approach? I'll just be interested in your thoughts on that.
Well, so Lisa, concerning your first question, yes, I think yes, it would be. I will not elaborate. I think the answer is simply yes. Your idea would be extremely valuable, particularly to justify the design. I think. Because sometimes the rationale for using a specific design is not entirely clear, even for us. And so it would be, but more generally in a publication, but even for regulatory whatever, sometimes you see a company coming with a specific design and you don't understand the rationale. Examples where these designs were in a way fed the products, yes. I think for products like larotrectinib, entrectinib, well, fine, they were authorized in the US, but I think the way the clinical development was approached was at some kind of limitations in Europe, for example. These products were authorized, but they were heavily criticized. You still don't know. There are a lot of uncertainty surrounding these products, and so it was I think a clinical development which was badly designed and gave some discredit to did not give credit to the products. Yes, other examples, I think beside recovery, I think Stampede, trials like Stampede, it was a landmark study, and this is Stampede which really triggered, in fact, the whole story around platform trials, and Stampede was some other platform. They really demonstrated, in fact, the incredible value of these kind of studies. So iSpy also, because they involve companies, they were incredibly useful, and everybody's quoting Stampede now when we are talking about platform studies. So